The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple as Peter and his friends wandered aimlessly through the streets of a small town. It was an ordinary afternoon, perhaps even boring, and the group of teenagers found nothing to spark their interest. They walked in silence, kicking small stones on the asphalt, until something unexpected broke the monotony. As they turned a corner, they spotted a familiar figure, the old man who lived at the end of the street. Known for being grumpy and for puncturing the balls of kids who ventured near his house, he had a questionable reputation among the younger children. However, with the teenagers, his demeanor was different. Whenever he met them, he exchanged a few words and even seemed to enjoy the conversation. Today was no different. Upon seeing them, the old man approached with a yellow smile and a curious look in his eyes. "What are you kids up to?" he asked, his tone a mix of interest and mild suspicion. The boys exchanged glances before one of them answered, almost in unison, that they were looking for something fun to do. The old man paused, as if pondering an idea that had just occurred to him. With an unexpected glint in his eyes, he proposed something unusual. "I have a house in another part of town that needs a good cleaning. It's not nearby, but if you're up for it, he'll pay you well and even throw in tickets for that concert everyone's talking about." The mention of the tickets made a few of the teenagers' eyes light up. However, the offer brought a mix of excitement and apprehension. Most were tempted by the reward, but Peter, who had always been more cautious, hesitated. Something about the old man's tone bothered him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. Despite his reservations, the decision was swift. The prospect of easy money and tickets was too tempting to pass up, and so the group accepted the proposal. Peter, still uneasy, glanced back at the old man's house as they walked away. He couldn't pinpoint why, but a shiver ran down his spine, like a dark omen of what was to come. Deep down, he knew that this seemingly ordinary afternoon would never be forgotten. The group continued walking, now with a purpose. The old man's offer hung over them like a heavy cloud, creating a strangely tense atmosphere. Peter followed a little behind, reflecting on the proposal. While the others chatted excitedly, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that consumed him. "Is it safe?" one of the friends asked, breaking the silence. The doubt had already been lingering, but no one wanted to be the first to voice it. One of the more enthusiastic boys quickly responded, "Of course it is. It's just cleaning an old house. And besides, he's going to pay well and give us free tickets. What could go wrong?" These words seemed to convince the more hesitant ones, except for Peter, who remained introspective. "Maybe we should think this over," he suggested, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. But his companions weren't willing to change their minds. The prospect of money and tickets outweighed any concerns. Night was already approaching, and the sky was starting to darken. With an almost unanimous decision, they followed the old man's directions to a part of town they were less familiar with. As they walked, the environment around them seemed to subtly change. The streets became more deserted, the houses older, and a sense of isolation began to settle in. Peter looked around, noticing the old buildings, many of which seemed abandoned. It felt as if they were entering unknown territory, where the rules of everyday life didn't apply. The sound of laughter and conversation that had previously filled the air was slowly replaced by an unsettling silence. Finally, they arrived in front of a large, worn-down house, almost swallowed by the surrounding vegetation. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time. The facade, covered in ivy, hid details that could have revealed more about its dark past. The imposing structure seemed to have once been a grand residence, but now it exuded a sense of decay. The boys stopped in front of the rusty gate, exchanging uncertain glances. "So, this is it?" one of them murmured, breaking the silence. No one answered immediately, but they all knew the answer. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. Peter, still reluctant, let out one last sigh before following his friends toward the house. Little did they know that by crossing that threshold, they were about to enter a nightmare from which they might not emerge unscathed. The gate creaked painfully as it was pushed open, as if protesting the intrusion. Peter and his friends stepped through the entrance, feeling the weight of the air around them, which seemed denser, almost oppressive. The stone path, now almost hidden by the overgrown vegetation, led them to the main entrance of the house, an imposing structure that seemed to defy time, though not decay. The windows were covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, obscuring the interior and revealing only indistinct shadows. The front door, made of solid wood, was ajar, as if it were already expecting their arrival. The sound of their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the house absorbed all noise, turning it into something distant and muffled. One of the boys, trying to break the tension, forced a smile and commented, "Looks like we're about to find some lost treasure here." But the joke fell flat. Everyone was too focused on what awaited them inside. Peter, his heart racing, touched the door to push it open completely. The wood groaned, revealing an entryway shrouded in shadows. The air was cold, despite the lingering warmth outside. The evening light that filtered through the curtains barely illuminated the space, highlighting only vague shapes of furniture covered in white sheets and layers of dust that seemed never to have been disturbed. The teenagers entered hesitantly, each one feeling the almost palpable presence of the house around them. There was a strange sensation, as if the house was alive, breathing with every move they made. The air smelled of mold and something indefinable, a mix of aged wood and something more pungent, perhaps even decaying. As they walked through the main corridor, Peter's eyes were drawn to an old painting on the wall. It was a portrait of a family, probably the former owners of the house, but there was something unsettling about their faces. The eyes of the figures seemed to follow their movements, something that made Peter shudder. He looked away, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the discomfort lingered. As they spread out through the house, each one took on what seemed like a simple task: clean, organize, sweep the accumulated dust. However, the silence that settled was soon interrupted by faint noises, like distant footsteps, even though none of them were out of sight. Peter, while cleaning an old fireplace, felt a chill run down his spine. He turned quickly, certain that someone was watching him, but all he saw was the darkness of the corridor. He took a deep breath, trying to push away the growing dread, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in that place. With each passing minute, the house seemed to become more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around them, trapping them in a labyrinth of darkness and ancient secrets. What had started as a simple task was beginning to transform into something much more sinister. As they moved through the rooms, the atmosphere inside the house became increasingly unsettling. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, seemed to absorb the little light that entered through the dusty windows, creating shadows that stretched out like spectral hands. Each step the teenagers took lifted a fine layer of dust, revealing that the place hadn't been inhabited in a long time. One of Peter's friends, driven by curiosity, pulled back one of the sheets covering a piece of furniture in the corner of the living room. Underneath, an old, cracked leather armchair was revealed, next to a small table with a porcelain doll sitting rigidly. The doll's glass eyes, dull and opaque, seemed to stare at the boy with an unsettling intensity. He quickly backed away, unnerved, while the others continued exploring the rest of the floor. Peter was drawn to a narrow corridor where the wooden doors creaked as they were opened. Behind one of them, he found a bedroom with an iron-framed bed and an old wardrobe. On the ceiling, a lamp swayed slightly, as if touched by a breeze that shouldn't exist inside. He approached the wardrobe, and upon opening it, was met with a strong, unpleasant odor, as if something had been rotting for a long time. But upon inspecting the interior, he found nothing but some old, moth-eaten clothes. Meanwhile, one of the other teenagers was descending a narrow staircase that led to the basement. Each step creaked under his weight, echoing through the empty space. Downstairs, the air was even denser, and the smell of dampness permeated the room. In the corner of the basement, he spotted some dusty boxes and a wooden chest with rusty hinges. When he tried to open the chest, he found it was locked, and despite his efforts, the lid wouldn't budge. He had the feeling that it would be better to leave it closed. Back on the upper floor, another friend was in one of the bedrooms, where he found a large mirror propped against the wall. The mirror was covered in a layer of dust, but when he wiped it with his hand, he noticed something strange. The surface reflected the room in a distorted way, as if the room were darker and more sinister than it actually was. When he looked closer, he had the impression that something was moving behind him, but when he turned, he saw only the empty room. Peter, still in the corridor, began to hear sounds coming from places where no one should be. They were low whispers, almost imperceptible, but clearly present. He tried to ignore them, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. But the murmurs became more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to communicate. The tension among the group grew as the minutes passed. At first, the cleaning seemed like a simple task, but the house was beginning to show its true colors. The place was imbued with a malevolent presence, something lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. What initially seemed like a game to earn some money and tickets was turning into a nightmare of visions and inexplicable sounds. They could barely predict what else the house had in store for them. The atmosphere inside the house was becoming unbearable. The already gloomy environment now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. As each of the teenagers busied themselves with some task, the sounds around them began to intensify, breaking the oppressive silence that had previously hung over them. Peter was in the corridor, near the staircase leading to the second floor, when he heard a peculiar sound. It was a faint whisper, like a breeze carrying disjointed words, but there was no wind inside. He stopped, trying to identify the source of the sound, but all he felt was a shiver running down his spine. He was no longer alone in that corridor, or at least, that's what his mind told him. Downstairs, one of his friends was in the kitchen, wiping down the dust-covered surfaces with a damp cloth. As he scrubbed the sink, he heard heavy footsteps above his head. He looked up at the ceiling, confused, as he knew no one had gone upstairs yet. The footsteps continued, slowly crossing the upper floor, as if something or someone was deliberately walking from one room to another. He called out to the others, but no one responded. He decided to ignore it, attributing the sound to some animal, but a part of him knew it wasn't that. At the same moment, another boy, who was in the living room, began to hear what sounded like faint scratching coming from one of the walls. He approached, trying to discover what was causing that disturbing noise. He pressed his ear to the wall, and to his horror, realized that the sound was coming from inside, as if something was trying to get out. His heart raced, and he quickly backed away, unsure whether he should tell the others. On the second floor, Peter, still disturbed by the whispers, heard the sound of a child's laughter echoing down the corridor. The laughter was soft, almost melancholic, but there were no children in that house. He followed the sound, which led him to a slightly ajar door at the end of the corridor. With a mix of fear and curiosity, he pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room decorated like an old nursery. The furniture was tiny, made for someone very small, and in the corner of the room there was a music box. The lid of the box was open, but the melody coming from it was distorted, as if the mechanism was old and rusty. Peter approached slowly, and just as he was about to close the box, the music stopped abruptly, and the room was plunged into a sepulchral silence. He felt the presence of something behind him, but when he quickly turned around, he found nothing but shadows dancing in the dim light. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, the sounds that had been light and sparse before began to converge. Footsteps, whispers, laughter, all seemed to blend into a cacophony of noises coming from all directions. The group began to realize that something was definitely wrong, and the silent fear they had tried to hide began to manifest. They gathered in the living room, exchanging nervous glances, each with a strange story to tell, but no one knew where to start. The discomfort grew. The house, which initially seemed just old and neglected, now revealed a dark and living side. The teenagers looked at each other, trying to find a rational explanation for the events. But deep down, they all knew the answer wasn't that simple. Something lurked in the shadows, something that was waiting, watching, and seemed to feed on their growing fear. The discomfort that hung over the teenagers turned into growing dread. The tension was palpable, and everyone felt that the house was closing in on them, like a predator circling its prey. Peter, still shaken by the sounds he had heard in the corridor, struggled to stay calm, but panic was beginning to take hold of his mind. One of the boys, Josh, who had always been the bravest of the group, decided to explore the upstairs alone in an attempt to show that it was all just coincidences. "I'll go take a look upstairs," he announced, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled slightly. Without waiting for a response, he climbed the stairs with firm steps, although his determination couldn't hide the knot in his stomach. The others stayed on the ground floor, exchanging nervous glances. The house, which seemed more sinister by the second, was enveloped in a dense silence, broken only by the occasional creaks of old wood. Minutes passed without any sign of Josh. "He's taking too long," one of the friends murmured, beginning to grow uneasy. Peter felt a knot form in his stomach, as if he knew something terrible was about to happen. Finally, unable to bear the weight any longer, another of the teenagers, Sam, decided to go after Josh. "He'll see what's going on," he said, trying to hide his fear. He climbed the stairs, with Peter and the others close behind, unwilling to be left alone in the room. When they reached the top of the stairs, they found the corridor in near total darkness, the only light coming from the twilight filtering through a small dusty window at the end of the hall. They called out for Josh, but there was no response. They decided to check each room, but all they found was emptiness and more silence. Until, when they opened the door to the last room, they were met with a sight that made their blood run cold. The room was cold, almost icy, and a sense of malevolent presence filled the space. On the floor, lying next to the bed, was Josh's phone, still with the screen on. It was in recording mode, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Sam picked up the phone with trembling hands and hit play on the last recording. In the video, Josh appeared entering the room, the camera shaking as he moved. He seemed to be exploring, quietly commenting on the strangeness of the place. But then, a subtle sound, a chilling whisper, echoed through the video, and the image became distorted. The screen went black for a few seconds, and when the image returned, the camera was lying on the floor, pointing at the ceiling, and then nothing more. Just silence, and Sam's heavy breathing echoing in the dark room. Desperate, the teenagers began frantically searching for any sign of Josh, but it was as if he had been swallowed by the house. There were no clues, no sounds, nothing to indicate where he was. Panic took hold, and the reality of what they were facing crashed down on them like a tidal wave. The house, once just strange and uncomfortable, now revealed itself as a malevolent entity, something that wouldn't let them leave without exacting a price. And Josh's disappearance was only the beginning of what was to come. Peter felt a wave of despair wash over him. He knew they needed to get out of there, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, made every move a life-or-death decision. As the group descended the stairs in silence, what had once been a mere suspicion was now a terrifying certainty. Something in the house wanted them there, and there were no guarantees that they would all make it out alive. Terror had gripped the group, and Josh's disappearance had transformed the already sinister atmosphere into a living nightmare. Unsure of what to do, the teenagers gathered on the ground floor, trying to formulate a plan. Peter, his heart pounding in his chest, knew they needed to act quickly, but the growing fear clouded his thoughts. "We have to find him," Sam said, his voice trembling, but with a desperate determination in his eyes. "We can't just leave him here." The others agreed, although reluctance was clear in each of them. The fear that whatever had taken Josh could be lurking in any shadow, in any room, was almost paralyzing. They split into two groups, each responsible for searching different parts of the house. Peter, Sam, and another friend took the upper floor, while the remaining two stayed to explore the ground floor and the basement. The stairs creaked ominously under their feet as they climbed, and the absolute silence that followed seemed to foreshadow something terrible. Upstairs, the corridors seemed longer and more twisted than before, as if the house itself was stretching, playing with their minds. The bedroom doors felt heavier, and the air was thick, almost impossible to breathe. The group moved cautiously, calling out for Josh, but the only response they received was the echo of their own voices. Peter felt time warping around them. It seemed like they had spent hours wandering those corridors, but the clock on his phone showed only a few minutes had passed. Every room they searched was empty, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Suddenly, Sam stopped abruptly, pointing to the end of a corridor that ended in a tall window. "Did you see that?" His voice was an anxious whisper. At the end of the corridor, Peter noticed a blurry figure that seemed to be watching them. It was motionless, with no discernible face, like a solidified shadow. He blinked, and the figure disappeared, leaving only the darkness behind. The chill running down Peter's spine intensified, and he knew the house was toying with them, distorting their perceptions and amplifying their fears. Meanwhile, downstairs, the other two boys had reached the basement. The staircase descending into the darkness seemed to extend into a bottomless abyss. The flashlight one of them held trembled in his hand, the beam of light struggling to penetrate the shadows. The basement was flooded with a deafening silence, as if sound had been sucked out of the environment. Every step was a challenge against the instinct screaming at them to turn back. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a large room, its walls covered in unbearable dampness. In the center stood an old table covered with a dirty sheet. As they approached, they noticed the sheet seemed to have dark stains, and a strong odor of rot filled the air. One of them lifted the fabric with trembling hands, only to find a set of unlit candles, and, beside them, a series of objects that looked like they had been used in some kind of ritual. Strange symbols were carved into the wood of the table, and something inside them screamed that this place should not be disturbed. Suddenly, a dull sound came from the corner of the basement, followed by a scratching noise, like nails scraping against concrete. The flashlight pointed toward the sound, but all they saw were dense shadows. However, both knew something was there, something watching them. Panic overtook them, and before they could react, one of the boys was dragged into the darkness, his muffled scream echoing through the basement. The remaining group upstairs heard the scream and ran to the stairs, only to find the other boy emerging from the basement, pale and in shock, muttering incoherently. He was alone. Panic now gripped them entirely. Peter knew they were being hunted, that the house would not let them leave easily. The search for Josh had turned into a desperate race for survival, and they had barely begun to understand what they were up against. Now, it was only a matter of time before the house claimed another one of them. The house, which had already seemed like a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, now revealed itself to be openly hostile. The group, shaken by the loss of another friend, was on the verge of collapse. Peter knew that panic was the worst thing that could happen at that moment, but keeping it under control was becoming impossible. As they tried to process what had happened in the basement, Sam, still holding Josh's phone, noticed something strange. The screen flickered, and a video file that hadn't been there before appeared. With trembling fingers, he pressed play, and the recording began. In the video, Josh was once again exploring the house. This time, he was in a different room that none of them had found before. The walls of the room were covered in carved symbols, similar to those the boys had seen in the basement. Josh, visibly uncomfortable, was filming the details when something changed in the atmosphere. The image flickered, and for a brief moment, Josh's reflection in the room's mirror was replaced by a distorted figure with eyes that seemed to be made of pure darkness. The video cut off abruptly, and Sam looked at the others, panic written on his face. He found something that shouldn't be here. The words barely left his mouth. Peter felt a wave of despair, but also of determination. They needed to understand what was happening in this house. Otherwise, none of them would make it out alive. They decided to go back to the room from the video. After some time wandering through the twisting corridors, they finally found it. The walls, now visible under the faint light of their flashlights, were covered with the same strange symbols Josh had filmed. Peter ran his fingers over one of the carvings, feeling an unnatural cold radiating from the marks in the wood. On closer inspection, he realized the symbols were part of some ancient ritual, but their meaning was beyond anything they could comprehend. In the center of the room was a table covered with a stained cloth. When they lifted the fabric, they uncovered an old book, its leather cover worn and covered in dust. The title, almost illegible, was written in a language unknown to them. Peter hesitated for a moment, but knew they had no choice. They needed to find out what was happening here. He carefully opened the book, and the yellowed pages were filled with drawings and writings that seemed to belong to a cult or sect. There were descriptions of rituals that invoked forces beyond human understanding, forces that fed on fear and pain. The illustrations depicted dark figures, with faces obscured by shadows, surrounded by children and teenagers, their expressions frozen in terror. Sam, reading over Peter's shoulder, found a passage that made his blood run cold. The text described an entity that inhabited the house, an ancient creature that demanded sacrifices to maintain its existence. The ritual involved trapping young souls and torturing them with their greatest fears, feeding the entity and strengthening its presence in the physical world. Peter realized they were facing something far more terrifying than they had imagined. The house was not just haunted, it was a trap, a place designed to lure the unsuspecting and trap them forever. And now, they were the next victims of this macabre ritual. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, coming toward the room. They were heavy and dragged, different from the ones they had heard before. Everyone froze, their breath caught in their throats. They knew what was approaching was not one of their missing friends. Something had been awakened, and it was coming to claim what it believed to be its own. The terror that enveloped them was absolute. Their only hope was to escape, but now, with the house distorting their perceptions and the entity awakened, the chances of getting out were growing slimmer by the second. They knew they had to act quickly, or else they would become just another forgotten story, lost within the walls of that cursed place. The sound of footsteps grew closer, resonating through the corridors with a slow and deliberate cadence. The teenagers, paralyzed by fear, knew that something inhuman was on its way. Peter snapped the book shut, his heart pounding in his chest, and signaled for the others to move silently. They knew their only chance of survival was to flee that room and try to find an exit from the house before it was too late. With careful movements, they headed toward the door, trying not to make a sound. When Sam took the first step outside, an indistinct figure appeared at the end of the corridor. The creature seemed to be made of shadows and darkness, its undefined shapes writhing and stretching across the walls as if the house itself were alive and conspiring against them. Its eyes, glowing a deep red, locked onto the group with an insatiable hunger. Sam, struggling to stay calm, made a desperate gesture for everyone to run. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely as the footsteps echoed, now faster and closer. Fear grew within each of them as they felt the air around them grow heavier, almost suffocating, as if the malevolent presence was draining all their life force. Peter led the group, forcing himself to stay focused. When they reached a fork in the corridor, he turned left, guided by instinct and a vague memory that this direction would lead them back to the stairs. However, as they rounded the corner, he stopped abruptly. The corridor that should have been there had simply disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. They were being cornered. The creature was approaching, its footsteps now sounding like the beating of war drums, each impact a thud in Peter's chest. In a desperate act, he pushed open a nearby door, and the group entered a room that seemed as strange as the rest of the house. The walls were covered in old mirrors, tarnished by time, reflecting distorted versions of their faces. The surfaces glimmered with a faint spectral light, creating the illusion that there was much more within that space than truly existed. As they tried to catch their breath, a chilling presence filled the room. Each mirror began to emanate a biting cold, as if something malevolent was about to manifest through them. Peter stared into one of the mirrors, and to his horror, saw the image of Josh, not as he was, but as something horrifically distorted, with a face contorted in silent agony. Suddenly, the surfaces of the mirrors began to warp as if they were melting, and ghostly figures emerged from within them. They were pale, with vacant eyes and mouths open in screams that no one could hear. They began to advance, their translucent forms slowly moving toward the teenagers, their ghostly hands reaching out to touch and drag the living into the reflections. Sam screamed, shoving a mirror out of the way, but the ghostly figure merely flowed toward him, ignoring the physical barrier. Each second felt like an eternity as they tried to escape the approaching specters. Peter, realizing the room was cornering them even more, looked around desperately until he noticed a small window in the farthest corner. "Over here!" he shouted, and everyone moved with a speed driven by pure survival instinct. One of Peter's friends, the fastest, reached the window and forced it open, only to find it led to a narrow, dark alley surrounded by high walls. Still, it was the only escape they had left. They began to climb through the window, one by one, as the spirits tried to grab hold of them. Peter was the last to go through, feeling the cold touch of one of the specters on his ankle as he pulled himself out. The penetrating cold that shot through his body told him he had little time before the effects of the touch became permanent. With a final burst of strength, he squeezed through the tight space and fell into the alley outside. They were free from the room, but not from the house. The alley led directly to the back of the mansion, but the walls around them were tall and unscalable. The only way forward was down a path that seemed to lead to a shadow-covered garden. They could feel that the house was still hunting them, that the entities still wanted them within its walls. But for now, they had narrowly escaped. As they moved forward through the garden, the air grew heavier, as if they were entering even more dangerous territory. The shadows seemed to shift, and the feeling of being watched never left them. The race for their lives continued, and they knew the next mistake could be fatal. The garden at the back of the mansion was a maze of thick, untamed vegetation. Ancient trees with twisted branches formed a kind of canopy, blocking out what little light remained. The group moved quickly, their hearts pounding frantically, as they felt the shadows closing in around them. Every step seemed to lead them deeper into the darkness, further from safety. Peter led the group, his eyes scanning the area for an exit, but everything around them seemed to converge on a single point. An old, abandoned greenhouse with broken windows and wide-open doors. A smell of decay emanated from within, mingling with the damp odor of the soaked earth. The place exuded a sense of despair and claustrophobia, but it seemed to be their only option. "There!" Sam shouted, pointing to the structure. Without a second thought, they all ran toward the greenhouse, hoping they could hide or find a way out. As they entered, the door slammed shut violently behind them, as if the house itself had decided to seal their fate. The interior of the greenhouse was a chaos of dead plants and shattered pots. Dry vines tangled in the ceiling and hung down like twisted claws, while the floor was covered in a thick layer of rotting leaves. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of death and something else, something unbearably sweet that mingled with the environment. Peter realized the place was far from a safe refuge. The broken glass of the windows let in cold drafts, but also allowed the shadows outside to creep in, moving unnaturally. They huddled together in the center of the greenhouse, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger by the second. Suddenly, The sound of shattering glass echoed through the greenhouse, and one of the remaining windows burst, sending shards flying in all directions. The creature they had seen in the corridor, a mass of distorted shadows, slithered in, gliding fluidly and quickly across the floor. Its red eyes glowed with a malignant intensity, and its body seemed to be in constant mutation, as if the darkness itself was alive and pulsating. Before they could react, the dry vines on the ceiling began to move, suddenly and aggressively coming to life. They extended like serpents, quickly descending toward the group. In a split second, Sam was grabbed by one of the vines, which wrapped around his neck, lifting him off the ground as he struggled desperately to break free. His eyes widened in panic as he tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the deadly grip. Peter, seeing his friend in danger, grabbed a piece of broken glass and tried to cut the vine, but he was repelled by a fierce blow that threw him against the wall of the greenhouse. The impact left him dazed, but he forced himself to stand, his vision blurred and his breathing heavy. Around him, the others were trying to fight off the vines, now attacking them from all sides. But the situation was quickly becoming desperate. The shadow creature, now fully inside the greenhouse, watched the scene with predatory calm, its eyes fixed on Peter. It was as if it was waiting, feeding off the terror emanating from the group, growing stronger with their fear. Peter knew they couldn't keep going like this. With one last surge of willpower, he got up and started cutting the vines holding Sam, but each strike only seemed to further enrage the entity attacking them. When he finally managed to free his friend, the damage had already been done. Sam was unconscious, and his breathing was weak and irregular. Desperate, Peter looked around for a way to escape. He spotted an iron door in the corner of the greenhouse that seemed to lead outside. "This way!" he shouted, trying to drag Sam with him. The others, despite their absolute terror, ran toward the door, fighting off the vines that tried to grab them. When they reached the iron door, Peter pushed it with all his strength. It opened with a metallic groan, revealing a narrow exit leading to a dark, winding path. One by one, they passed through the door, but the shadow creature was not willing to let them go so easily. It lunged toward them but was blocked by the iron door, which slammed shut behind them, as if an invisible force was protecting them, or merely guiding them into another kind of trap. The group, now outside, breathed heavily, their bodies and minds exhausted. They had managed to escape the greenhouse, but they knew they were still not safe. The path ahead was dark and filled with unknown dangers, but they had no choice but to follow it. The house was alive, and the deadly game it played was far from over. Each step they took led them deeper into a nightmare from which there might be no return. The group followed the narrow path, the darkness around them almost impenetrable. The silence was absolute, broken only by the labored breathing of the teenagers and the distant sounds of something moving in the vegetation. Peter, carrying Sam with the help of the others, felt the weight of despair growing with each step. They were exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the feeling that they were being led to some dark fate was inescapable. The path led them to a clearing where a small wooden cabin stood. The structure seemed in complete contrast to the mansion they had left behind, simple, rustic, and somehow even more sinister. A faint light shone through the cracks in the door, and the smell of smoke hung in the air, as if someone was burning something inside. Peter hesitated for a moment, but knew they couldn't turn back. With Sam nearly unconscious, they needed shelter and any help they could find. He approached the door and pushed it open slowly, revealing the interior of the cabin. The space was small, lit only by a fire burning in the corner. In the center of the room, sitting in an old, rusty chair, was the old man who had offered them the job of cleaning the house. His eyes, once friendly, were now empty, almost lifeless, and a twisted smile crossed his wrinkled face. His presence there, in a place that seemed so isolated and disconnected from the world, was a shock to the group. "You've finally arrived," the old man said, his voice hoarse and filled with a malice they had not perceived before. "I've been waiting for you." Peter felt a chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong, and he knew the old man had a role in everything they were experiencing. "What have you done to us? What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though he was terrified. The old man let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound reverberating through the cabin like an echo of something much older and more malevolent. "You haven't figured it out yet. You were chosen. The house. It needs young souls to continue existing, and I am just the guardian, the facilitator of the process." The old man's words fell upon them like a death sentence. The house was a trap, a place designed to capture and devour those foolish enough to enter, and the old man was responsible for ensuring that new victims were always available. Peter took a step forward, anger and fear mixing in his chest. "Why? Why do this to us? What do you gain from it?" The old man tilted his head, his smile growing disturbingly wider. "I was once young like you, caught in the same trap, but the house offered me a deal. Serve it, bring fresh souls, and in return, I wouldn't age, wouldn't die. And so, I became a part of it, just as you are about to become." The group fell silent, the old man's words spinning in their minds. They had fallen into a carefully laid trap, and now they were being hunted by something that wasn't of this world, something that would slowly consume them. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth crackled, and the flames flared up, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The old man stood up from his chair, his movements now quicker and more agile than they should have been for someone his age. "But you still have a choice," he said, his voice turning into an insidious whisper. "You can join me, serve the house, and escape the fate that's been set for you. Or you can resist and face what's coming." Peter looked at his friends, the terror in their eyes reflecting his own. The old man's proposal was a trap within a trap, a way to try and corrupt them, to make them give in to despair. But deep down, Peter knew they couldn't give in. "We won't help you," he said, his voice firm despite the fear. "We're getting out of here, and you won't stop us." The old man's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold anger. "Then you've chosen the hard way," he hissed. "The house will claim what is hers, and I will watch as each of you is consumed." Suddenly the cabin door burst open with a bang, and a freezing wind rushed in, extinguishing the flames in the hearth. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the old man, along with everything around him, began to disintegrate, as if he were dissolving into a black mist that spread through the air. The ground began to tremble, and the walls of the cabin seemed to close in around them. Peter grabbed Sam's hand and shouted for the others to run. They bolted out of the cabin, back into the darkness of the garden, with the sensation that the very earth beneath their feet was crumbling. The old man had vanished, but his threat still hung over them, and the house was alive, ready to continue the deadly game. They knew they couldn't stop, couldn't hesitate. The fight for their lives was just beginning, and the house still had many dark surprises in store. Running away from the cabin, the group plunged once more into the darkness of the garden, their feet crunching the dry leaves that covered the ground like a carpet of brittle bones. The cold wind blew from all directions, carrying distant whispers that seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the house was calling to them, demanding their souls as payment. Peter led the group, his mind racing as he searched for a plan of escape. They couldn't just keep running aimlessly. They needed a strategy, something that would give them a chance to break free from this living nightmare. But the darkness around them was complete, and the garden seemed to stretch on endlessly with no sign of an exit. Suddenly, Sam, who was beginning to regain consciousness, mumbled something incoherent. Peter quickened his pace, trying to help his friend stay on his feet. "We'll get out of this, Sam. We just need to keep moving," he said, more to himself than to his friend. The others followed close behind, the panic visible on their faces. They were being hunted, and every shadow, every twisted tree seemed to hide some new horror. The sensation of constantly being watched never left them, as if the darkness itself was alive, enveloping and malevolent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the group spotted something different. An opening in the vegetation, where a stone path led to an old greenhouse with shattered glass. The structure was partially covered in ivy, and most of the glass had been broken, leaving jagged holes in the transparent walls. "There!" one of the boys shouted, pointing to the greenhouse. It was a chance, maybe a place to take shelter or, with luck, find a clue on how to escape. Peter hesitated for a moment, remembering what had happened in the other greenhouse, but he knew they had few options left. They ran toward the structure, the uneven ground making their movements difficult. When they finally reached the entrance, Peter stopped abruptly, sensing a strange energy in the air. There was something different about this greenhouse, something he couldn't define, but that made him shiver with anticipation. As they entered, the teenagers were greeted by a cold, damp environment. The plants that once grew there were dead, their dry branches forming distorted shadows against the glass walls. In the center of the greenhouse was a circle of stones, each one marked with ancient symbols, similar to those they had seen in the book in the cabin. The group gathered around the circle, trying to understand what they were seeing. "This looks like an altar," one of them said, his voice trembling. Peter examined the stones more closely and realized they were arranged deliberately, forming some kind of diagram. Suddenly, a feeling of vertigo overcame them all. The air in the greenhouse seemed to vibrate, and the symbols on the stones began to glow with a faint light, as if reacting to their presence. Before they could react, the glass doors of the greenhouse slammed shut with a deafening crash, and an invisible force pushed them into the circle. The energy around them grew in intensity, and a sense of absolute despair washed over them. Peter tried to step out of the circle, but an invisible barrier stopped him, as if a wall of glass was there, trapping them inside that profane space. The light from the stones grew brighter, and the symbols began to move, slowly spinning around the group. "This is a trap," one of the boys shouted, trying in vain to break the barrier. But the forces at work were far more powerful than anything they could fight against. The entire greenhouse began to tremble, and the temperature dropped drastically as a shadowy presence started to form in the center of the circle. It was an indistinct figure, made of shadows and darkness, its outlines shifting like smoke. The creature raised a skeletal hand, and the lights in the symbols flickered out abruptly, plunging the greenhouse into total darkness. Peter felt the cold spread through his body, as if he were being frozen from the inside. He tried to scream, but his voice was choked off by the invisible force now enveloping them. The shadow creature moved closer, and in its empty eyes, Peter saw the reflection of everything they feared most. They were trapped, caught by the very despair the house was feeding on. Each of them knew the exit was there, somewhere outside the circle, but terror had paralyzed them, tying their minds and bodies in a mental and physical snare. The entity was feeding on them, draining their strength, their will to fight. But Peter, even in the midst of the deepest fear, felt a small spark of resistance. He knew that somehow they had to break the control that thing had over them. "We can't let this beat us," he thought, trying to reach out to the others with his mind. The creature drew even closer, and the darkness around them seemed to solidify, forming impenetrable walls. But with a final effort, Peter managed to reach out to one of the stones on the ground. When he touched it, a wave of energy coursed through his body, and he knew at that moment there was a way to escape. "Everyone, touch the stones," he shouted, his voice finally breaking the deathly silence. One by one, the others reached out, hesitantly touching the stones. The darkness around them began to retreat, as if the force holding the creature there was being weakened. The greenhouse started to shake violently, and the creature let out a high-pitched scream, as if it were being destroyed from within. The barrier around them disintegrated, and the darkness was replaced by an intense white light that filled the greenhouse. With a final effort, Peter and the others got up and ran for the exit, the light blinding them as the creature dissolved into nothing. When they finally made it out, The greenhouse collapsed behind them in an explosion of glass and stone. The garden was quiet, the darkness still present, but less oppressive. They had managed to break free from that trap, but they knew the danger was not over. The house, or whatever controlled that place, would not give up so easily. The group continued their desperate struggle for survival, aware that each step led them deeper into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The escape from the greenhouse left the group exhausted and disoriented. They dragged themselves away from the destruction, their heavy breaths mingling with the cold, damp air of the garden. The house continued to watch them, silent, but filled with a malevolent presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Peter knew that time was running out. Every second they spent in that place brought them closer to an inevitable end. Sam, still weak and injured, could barely stand. The others were equally shaken, their minds and bodies on the verge of collapse. But there was a silent determination among them all, a mutual understanding that they had to keep fighting, even if the odds were against them. Moving through the garden, they found an old, rusted iron gate, partially hidden by dense vegetation. The gate led to a narrow, moss-covered path that seemed to stretch toward the deepest part of the property. It was a direction none of them wanted to take, but the feeling that they were being pushed there, like pieces in a cruel game, was undeniable. Peter pushed the gate, which creaked loudly, echoing in the silence. The group hesitated before moving forward, each of them feeling the weight of the decision they were about to make. They knew that by crossing that gate, they were entering territory where hope would be even scarcer. The path led them to a clearing where a huge, gnarled tree dominated the center. Its thick, knotted roots spread across the ground like tentacles, trying to grasp anything that came near. Around the tree were several ancient tombstones, covered in moss and nearly illegible. It was a forgotten cemetery, a place where time seemed to have stopped. Peter felt a deep chill as he looked at the tombstones. Something about that place was terribly wrong, as if it were the dark heart of the property, the center of all the evil that had enveloped them since they entered the house. He approached one of the tombstones and tried to read what was engraved on it, but the words were too worn to be understood. However, a strange feeling overcame him. Those tombstones were markers of something more than just graves. Suddenly, Sam fell to his knees, gasping. The others rushed to help him, but something stopped them from getting close. An invisible, powerful force emanated from the tree, as if it were holding Sam in place. He looked up, pale, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is where it all ends." Peter felt the weight of those words like a blow to the chest. He knew Sam was right, but he didn't want to accept it. He tried to pull him away, but the invisible force that held him was unbreakable. The tree seemed to be feeding on his energy, draining his life as if it were an extension of the house. Sam looked at his friends, a glint of determination in his eyes. "You have to get out of here, now, before it's too late." He knew he didn't have much time. The tree was claiming his soul, and he couldn't fight it. But there was still a chance for the others, one last opportunity to escape this nightmare. Peter hesitated, guilt and despair consuming him. He didn't want to leave Sam behind, but deep down, he knew there was no other choice. "Sam," he began, but he was cut off. "Go!" Sam shouted, his voice filled with pain and urgency. "Run! Save yourselves!" The others, tears in their eyes, began to back away slowly, knowing they were leaving a friend behind. Peter was the last to move, fighting against every instinct that made him want to stay and fight. But he knew Sam was right. The only hope the group had left was to move forward, no matter how cruel the reality was. As they ran from the clearing, the sight of Sam becoming an indistinct figure, wrapped in the roots of the tree, was the last image Peter saw. Sam's sacrifice gave them a small advantage, but victory was far from guaranteed. The house, and whatever controlled it, wouldn't give up so easily. The group continued to run, hearts broken, but determination renewed. They knew Sam had given his life so they could have one last chance to escape, and they wouldn't waste that opportunity. The garden seemed endless, but now, more than ever, they were determined to survive, to flee from this infernal trap. But the terror was still there, pulsating around them, reminding them that the true battle was only beginning. Sam's sacrifice weighed on the group like a constant shadow. Every step they took was filled with a mixture of fear and guilt, but also a fierce determination to honor the memory of their fallen friend. The house had shown its cruelty, and they knew the path ahead would be even more dangerous. The garden seemed endless, and the environment around them grew increasingly oppressive. The wind had completely ceased, leaving the air still and dense, as if the world around them was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Peter led the group, his senses alert to any sign of danger, but the silence was unsettling, a calm before the storm. Finally, they spotted something ahead, a structure partially hidden by vegetation. It was an old shed, its wooden walls rotted by time and moisture. The windows were broken, and the door was ajar, revealing the dark interior. The building looked like it was on the verge of collapse, but Peter felt a strange pull toward it, as if there was something inside they needed to discover. "Should we go in?" one of the friends asked, his voice heavy with hesitation. No one wanted to venture into another dark place, but at the same time, they all felt there was no other choice. Peter nodded, though a part of him screamed to keep running. They approached the shed cautiously, each of them feeling the growing cold that emanated from the structure. When Peter pushed the door fully open, they were met by a strong smell of mold and damp earth. The interior of the shed was so dark that they could barely see beyond what the faint light coming through the broken windows allowed. As they entered, they realized the shed was full of old tools and rusted objects. Shovels, hoes, and axes hung on the walls, covered in cobwebs and dust. In the center of the room, a large wooden table was covered with yellowed papers and old books, some of which seemed to have been left there long ago. Peter felt a sense of unease as he scanned the objects, but something on the table caught his attention. Amidst the papers was a map. He picked it up carefully, trying to avoid the fragile paper from disintegrating in his hands. As he unfolded it, Peter saw that it was a detailed map of the property. There were marks at several points, but what caught his attention most was a particular mark, made in red, which seemed to indicate a specific point beneath the house. "What is it?" one of the friends asked, looking over Peter's shoulder. "It's a map of the house and the surrounding grounds," Peter replied, his voice low, "and it looks like there's something hidden under the house, something the old man didn't want anyone to find." The discovery brought a new wave of anxiety, but also hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to end the nightmare they were living. If the map was correct, the mark indicated the location of a hidden door or passage in the basement of the house, something that could be the key to understanding what was really happening. "We have to go back to the house," Peter said, despite the obvious fear in his voice. "If we find this passage, maybe we can figure out how to stop all this." The others exchanged glances, clearly terrified at the thought of returning to the house. But at the same time, they knew there was no other option. Running wouldn't solve anything. They needed to face the house and its secrets head-on. Without further discussion, the group left the shed and began walking back toward the mansion. The path seemed longer and darker than before, as if the very ground was trying to slow them down. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the mansion's shadowy silhouette emerged ahead of them, imposing and threatening. The house looked even more alive now, with every window appearing like eyes watching them as they approached. But Peter was determined. They hadn't sacrificed so much to give up now. With the map in hand, he led the group toward the house's entrance one last time. As they entered, the silence enveloped them like a shroud. The tension was palpable, and every noise, no matter how small, made them jump. They descended into the basement, guided by the faint light of their flashlights. The air there was even more suffocating, heavy with the promise of something terrible to come. When they finally reached the basement's bottom, they began searching for the hidden door the map indicated. The search was slow and desperate, but then, almost by accident, Peter found a crack in the wall in a dark corner. He ran his hand along the surface and felt the stone give slightly under the pressure. "It's here," he whispered, a mix of fear and relief in his voice. With the others' help, he pushed the wall, which opened to reveal a narrow, dark passage. The air that wafted out of the opening was cold and smelled of mold and decay. The feeling that they were about to discover something terrible was overwhelming, but they knew they couldn't turn back. Peter took a deep breath and stepped inside, followed by the others. The darkness seemed to swallow each of them as they advanced, and whatever awaited them at the end of that passage, they knew it would be decisive. They had found the hidden door, but the real battle was just beginning. The heart of the house was there, in the depths, and whatever they found might very well be the end of them all. The narrow passage they had discovered led them to an underground tunnel, its walls made of ancient, worn stone. The air there was dense and humid, laden with a metallic smell that reminded them of old blood. The darkness felt alive, a palpable presence that accompanied them with every step, as if the house itself was watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Peter led the group, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he illuminated the path ahead. The tunnel seemed endless, curving and stretching beyond what their eyes could see. Every step echoed with a sinister resonance, and the sound of droplets falling from the ceiling created a macabre melody that heightened their sense of unease. After walking for what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a circular chamber. The ceiling was high, supported by columns that rose like giant bones. In the center of the room, a stone structure dominated the space, an ancient altar covered in symbols and carvings that glowed with a faint, ethereal light. It was a sight both hypnotic and terrifying, a relic of forgotten times that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "This is it," Peter murmured, a shiver running down his spine. "This is the heart of the house." The group cautiously approached the altar, their eyes fixed on the strange symbols decorating its surface. There was something deeply disturbing about those markings, as if they were fragments of a forgotten language meant to invoke forces beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber began to pulse, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through the walls, coming from all directions. It was an ancient voice, filled with power and hatred, that made the air around them vibrate. "You have come far," the voice said, with a tone that seemed to mock them. "But to leave here alive, you must answer the riddle. Only a sacrifice of courage and wisdom will allow you to survive." The group fell silent, fear evident on their faces. Peter, feeling the gravity of the situation, stepped forward, determined to face whatever was necessary. "What is the riddle?" he asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. The voice chuckled softly, a sound like claws scratching a metal surface. "You must decipher the secret of the altar," it replied. "Carved upon it are the words that will free the house, or condemn you forever. Solve it or perish." Peter looked at the altar, panic rising within him. The inscriptions were complex, a mix of symbols and letters that seemed to shift and move as he watched. It was as if the altar was alive, resisting any attempt to understand it. He knew time was running out, and that failure would cost not just his life but the lives of everyone there. The others gathered around, trying to help, but they were equally confused. The tension grew with each passing second, and the sense that they were about to be swallowed by darkness was overwhelming. Peter forced his mind to focus, trying to see beyond the fear, beyond the chaos. Suddenly, something clicked in his mind. A distant memory of a story he had read as a child about ancient symbols and their representations. The symbols on the altar weren't just letters or random drawings. They represented fundamental elements, forces of nature, and the balance between life and death. With this new insight, Peter began to mentally reorganize the symbols, trying to find a pattern. His hands shook as he pointed to each symbol, combining them in a way that formed a logical sequence. The others watched in silence, hope and terror mixed on their faces. When he finally completed the sequence, Peter spoke the words aloud, his voice echoing through the chamber. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, and time seemed to stop. But then, the altar began to glow with an intense light, and the symbols Peter had deciphered lit up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The chamber shook violently, and the guttural voice let out a scream of rage and pain. "You have succeeded," it hissed, as the light around the altar intensified, reaching a blinding brilliance. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to crack, and the altar disintegrated in an explosion of energy. The group was thrown to the ground as the chamber collapsed around them. Peter felt an invisible force pulling him, and for a moment he thought everything was lost. But then the darkness was torn apart by daylight. The ceiling of the chamber collapsed, revealing the sky above. They had done the impossible. They had destroyed the heart of the house, and with it broken its malevolent hold. The house crumbled around them, its corrupted foundations finally giving way. Peter and the others got to their feet, dazed but alive. They stood in the center of a field of rubble, but as they looked around, they realized the house was disappearing, as if it had been a nightmare from which they were finally waking. Exhausted and injured, they began to walk away, not looking back. The house, now reduced to ruins, would no longer follow them. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left on their souls would last forever. The field of rubble where the mansion once stood now seemed deserted and silent. The group, wounded and exhausted, walked toward the property's exit. The feeling of relief mixed with the fear that something more was still lurking. The sky above was grey, as if the world itself was mourning what had happened in that place. But despite the devastation, Peter couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, a sense that something was still deeply wrong. As they slowly moved forward, the debris around them began to change. Peter was the first to notice. The ruins of the house, which should have been scattered and still, were rearranging themselves. Rocks rolled into place, as if an invisible giant was moving them. The group stopped, watching in horror and fascination as the stones aligned, forming a perfect circle around them. "This can't be happening," one of the friends murmured, panic growing in his voice. "We thought we destroyed the house." Peter looked around, the realization of what was happening finally dawning on him like a cold wave. "It wasn't the house itself," he said, his voice grim. "It was something much older, much deeper. The house was just a shell, a prison for something that is now free." Before they could react, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. The stones forming the circle glowed with a sinister light, and the air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if an invisible presence was pressing against their bodies. It was as if the world itself was contracting, focusing all its malevolence on that single point. In the center of the circle, a figure began to materialize. It wasn't human, nor entirely corporeal. It was a shadow, tall and contorted, made of pure darkness. Its eyes, 2 points of red light, watched the group with an ancient hunger, a malevolence that seemed to have waited eons for this moment. "You have freed the Guardian," the guttural voice echoed in their minds, not in their ears. "The house was bound for centuries, but now, thanks to you, I am free." Peter felt a wave of despair, but also of guilt. They had thought they were destroying the evil, but instead, they had unleashed something far worse. The Guardian, this entity made of shadow and hatred, was now free to spread its terror beyond the property's boundaries. "Run!" Peter shouted, his voice filled with desperation. but as they tried to flee, they found their legs were heavy, as if gravity had multiplied. The Guardian extended a long shadowy arm, and the darkness around them began to close in, swallowing the daylight, turning the world into an eternal night. Peter's friends tried to move, but were immediately paralyzed by an invisible force. The creature drew closer, savoring the fear in their eyes. "You are the first of many," the voice hissed, "but not the last. Each of you will bear my mark, and wherever you go, I will follow. You brought this into the world, and now you will be part of it." Peter felt a cold, ethereal hand grip his shoulder, and a sharp pain shot through his body. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. Around him, the others were also being marked, their expressions frozen in a mixture of horror and agony. Suddenly, a wave of energy emanated from the circle, and the pain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The darkness dissipated, and the shadowy figure of the Guardian vanished, leaving the group lying on the ground, breathing heavily. But something had changed. When Peter stood up, he felt a strange presence within him, something cold and unrelenting. He looked at the others and saw that they too were different. Their skin was pale, and their eyes, once full of life, now seemed to reflect an inner shadow. They were marked, not physically, but spiritually. The Guardian had left its essence in them, a curse they would carry forever. Without words, the group began to walk toward the property's exit. Each step seemed more difficult, the world around them losing its color and life. They knew they were not free, that the presence of the Guardian would follow them wherever they went. True freedom had been stolen from them, and now they were prisoners of a terror they could never fully escape. As the property disappeared behind them, Peter felt a single tear roll down his cheek. Not out of fear, but of acceptance. They had unleashed something that couldn't be destroyed, something that would live inside them until the end of their days. And wherever they went, the Guardian would be lurking, always waiting, always hungry. The nightmare that seemed to have ended was just beginning. The journey back to the city felt endless. The group, now marked by the Guardian's malevolent presence, walked in silence, their steps slow and heavy. The world around them seemed distorted, as if an invisible mist was seeping into their minds, erasing any trace of hope that might have remained. Peter led the group, his mind tormented by guilt and despair. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Guardian, felt its presence inside him, like a poison slowly spreading through his veins. The others were equally shaken, their faces pale and empty, their eyes reflecting the darkness that now resided within them. As they neared the city, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The streets that were once familiar now seemed strange, the buildings distorted, as if they were being watched by something malevolent. The silence was absolute, with not even the slightest sound of life. No birds sang, no wind blew. It was as if the entire world had held its breath, waiting for what was to come. Suddenly, the group stopped in front of the town's main square. What should have been a bustling place was now completely empty. In the center of the square, a large statue that once represented a local hero had changed. Now the statue was a dark, hooded figure, its sculpted eyes seeming to follow the group as they approached. Peter felt a deep chill as he looked at the statue. He knew, without a doubt, that the Guardian was there, waiting. "He's here," Peter whispered, and the others instinctively backed away from the statue. But they knew there was nowhere to run. The Guardian had followed them here, and now wanted to finish what he had started. Without warning, the figure in the statue began to move. The stone that formed it turned to flesh, and the creature broke away from its base, its red eyes glowing intensely. The square around them began to tremble, and the ground cracked open, spreading like malignant roots. "You thought you could escape me?" The Guardian's guttural voice echoed, filling the air with a sound that seemed made of pure hatred. "You brought this into the world, and now you will pay the ultimate price." Peter felt the terror growing inside him, but also something else, a deep anger, a determination he didn't know he had. He knew they couldn't defeat the Guardian physically, But maybe there was another way to face him, something they hadn't yet considered. Suddenly, Peter remembered the altar in the tunnel, the riddle they had solved to destroy the house. There was something there, a connection between the Guardian and the house, a bond that might be used against him. The house had been a shell, a prison, and they had freed the Guardian by destroying that prison. But if they could rebuild that prison somehow, maybe they could trap him again. "He's tied to the house," Peter said, his voice firm despite the fear consuming him. "We need to rebuild the circle, the symbol that held him. It's our only chance." The others looked at him doubtfully, but they knew they had no other option. Without hesitation, they began drawing the symbols they had seen on the altar on the ground of the square, using stones and shards of glass as makeshift tools. The Guardian, realizing what they were trying to do, advanced on them, his distorted form growing and becoming more threatening. "You will not succeed," the Guardian roared, his voice shaking the very air around them. But Peter and the others continued to work frantically, drawing the circle with precision, knowing that every second counted. When the circle was nearly complete, the Guardian launched one final attack, his shadowy claws reaching out to grasp Peter. But before he could reach him, the circle was finished, and a bright light erupted from the ground, burning the air around them. The Guardian screamed in pain and rage, his form disintegrating as the light engulfed him. He tried to escape, but the circle held him, pulling him back into the place from which he had come. The light grew in intensity, blinding everyone around, and the Guardian's scream became a distant echo until it vanished completely. When the light finally faded, the group was alone in the square, the ground around them completely intact, as if nothing had happened. The statue had returned to its original form, and the silence that surrounded them now seemed less oppressive, almost peaceful. Peter fell to his knees, exhausted, but with a deep sense of relief. The Guardian had been imprisoned again, but he knew what they had done was only a temporary fix. The evil that inhabited that place was not destroyed, only dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. They had won, but the victory had a bitter taste. The marks the Guardian had left on their souls would remain, and the knowledge that the nightmare could restart at any moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the sun began to set on the horizon, they knew that, even if the world around them seemed normal, something had changed forever. The battle was over, but the terror would never truly disappear. The sky was tinged with red and gold as the group finally began to leave the square. The city's silence was almost unbearable, as if the world was caught in an eternal pause, waiting for the next move. Peter and the others, marked by the battle with the Guardian, walked toward the edge of the city with slow, heavy steps, each of them carrying the weight of what they had experienced. As they neared the road leading out of town, the feeling of being watched persisted. Peter glanced back at the empty city and felt a deep shiver. The city that had once been alive and vibrant now seemed a monument to what had happened. A place where time and reality had been distorted, where the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead had been broken. When they reached the edge of the city, the group stopped in front of a rusted sign, which had once been the welcome sign. Now, covered in rust and vegetation, the sign seemed a macabre reminder that they should never have entered. Peter took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air seep into his lungs. They were on the verge of leaving, but something inside him hesitated. "Are we really free?" one of the friends asked, his voice hoarse and laden with uncertainty. Fear still permeated his words, the doubt about whether they had truly escaped or were trapped in another cycle of horror. Peter didn't have an answer. He looked down the road ahead, a stretch of asphalt that extended into the unknown. Darkness was approaching quickly, swallowing the horizon, but he knew they couldn't stop. The only choice was to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between them and that cursed place. "Let's go," Peter finally said, trying to inject some confidence into his words. "We have to get out of here." The group began walking again, their shadows long and distorted under the dim twilight. Every step was heavier than the last, the mental and physical exhaustion hitting them hard. The road seemed to stretch infinitely, as if it wanted to trap them in that moment of uncertainty and fear. As they walked, Peter couldn't help but look back, expecting to see something, anything that confirmed they were truly out of danger. But the city, now shrouded in darkness, was quiet. There were no signs of the Guardian, no strange noises or moving shadows. Just emptiness. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they saw a light ahead. It was a small gas station with a flickering fluorescent light above the entrance. The station looked abandoned, but it offered a glimpse of normality, something familiar amidst the chaos they had faced. The group approached cautiously, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Peter pushed the door of the station open, which creaked softly. The interior was sparse, with empty convenience shelves and a dust-covered counter. However, the most important thing was on the back wall, a telephone line. Finally, a way to call for help, one of the friends said, hope flickering in his eyes. Peter picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number, his hands still trembling. When the call finally connected, he felt immense relief. "Hello? We need help," he said, his voice nearly breaking. "We're trapped in a town. There's something terrible there. Please, get us out of here." The voice on the other end was calm and reassuring, but there was a coldness in it that Peter couldn't quite identify at first. "We'll send someone to get you," the voice responded. "But you must understand that not everything can be forgotten. Not everything can be left behind." Peter frowned, a new wave of discomfort washing over him. Before he could ask what that meant, the line went dead, leaving only the sound of the dial tone. "Let's wait here," Peter suggested, hanging up the phone and trying to shake off the feeling that something was still not right. They sat on the floor of the gas station, exhausted but trying to stay awake. The silence enveloped them again, and time seemed to drag on. The darkness outside grew denser, almost palpable, and Peter couldn't shake the feeling that somehow the Guardian was still watching them, that its presence still loomed over them like an indelible shadow. Hours passed before the lights of a vehicle finally illuminated the station. An old van, with the logo of an emergency service on the side, slowly pulled up to the entrance. Two men got out of the van, their expressions serious as they walked toward the group. "Are you the ones who called for help?" one of the men asked, his voice calm, but with a tone that indicated they already knew much more than they were willing to reveal. Peter nodded, feeling a new wave of distrust. Something about the men seemed off, but he was too tired to question it. They had no choice but to trust those who had come to rescue them. The men helped them into the van, their hands firm and emotionless. When the door closed, the interior of the vehicle went dark, lit only by the emergency lights on the dashboard. As the van started moving, Peter felt the weight of sleep approaching, his mind finally giving in to the extreme exhaustion. But just before he fell asleep, he heard a soft whisper coming from the front seat, where the men were sitting. It was the same voice he had heard on the phone, and the words were clear, carrying a sinister meaning. "What was unleashed will never be fully contained. You are part of it now, forever." The last thing Peter saw before succumbing to sleep was the Guardian's reflection in the rearview mirror, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. And then everything went black. The nightmare seemed to have ended, but the truth was far more terrifying. It would never end. Not as long as the Guardian was free, and its marks continued to pulse in the souls of those who dared to face it. "Hola,